Alrighty. Doing my re-record for pod37. I think I did one recording for this, wasn't happy with my progress on it, so I wanted to restart and to start again from discussion which I was getting into at the end of pod 36, which is when Socrates essentially starts to point out that concepts like justice, beauty, the good are not seen with the eyes or grasped with bodily senses, and therefore the reality of all of those things, that which each of them essentially is it contemplated through the body, or is this position whoever of us prepares himself best and most accurately to grasp that thing itself which he is investigating will come the closest to the knowledge of it. So they agree with him, and he says he will do this most perfectly who approaches the object with thought alone, without associating any sight with his thought or dragging in any sense perception with his reasoning, but who, using pure thought alone, tries to track down each reality pure and by itself, freeing him as far as possible from eyes and ears, and in a word, from the whole body, because the body confuses the soul and does not allow it to acquire truth and wisdom whenever it is associated with it. Will not that man reach reality, Simmius, if anybody does? Picking up kind of where we left off. So, again, we've kind of gone through the intellectual sort of tradition, especially of the Descartes and Kantian style of thinking about the objects by appreciating essentially the role to play of the mind in understanding of things, that understanding is not purely a matter of sense perception, but actually has more directly to do with reasoning. So pure thought alone tries to track down each reality pure and by itself, and you can say that's kind of an abstract concept, but then again, you know, we're thinking back to practical examples of this. Plato's Euthyphro, we've already seen that when somebody has a confused understanding of piety, they will propose forth as if they have all sorts of knowledge. Their knowledge can either be undermined by examination or accepted uncritically, and the best case scenario is for that person to have true belief, but they can never have justified true belief, so they don't act with knowledge, and then in the Socratic formula, therefore they don't act with virtue or in a virtuous way. So we have Plato and Socrates being expressed through Plato here, giving I guess what can be seen though as an idealist epistemology or metaphysics, just because it has to do with prioritizing these things that I think are ultimately the concepts of, you know, beauty or justice or the good or bigness, health, strength, etc. These are more evaluative, judgmental concepts that, again, in the sort of Kantian sphere of things, it goes beyond the mere sense perceptions or the intuitions, to give sort of Kantian terminology. It gets beyond the intuitions. It gets beyond mere conceptualization, which is, you know, representing representations and grouping things together, and then ascending to the level of, like in the Kantian framework, you go from the sense perceptions to the concepts to the arguments and ideas making utilization of the concept. So there's different levels to it, and all this stuff seemingly comes from this intellectual tradition here. So Socrates continues, all these things will necessarily make true philosophers believe and say to each other something like this: there is likely to be something such as a path to guide us out of our confusion, because as long as we have a body and our soul is fused with such an evil, we can never adequately attain what we desire, which we affirm to be the truth. The body keeps us busy in 1,000 ways because of its need for nurture. Moreover, if certain diseases befall it, they impede our search for the truth. It fills us with wants, desires, fears, all sorts of illusions, and much nonsense, so that, as it is said, in truth and in fact, no thought of any kind ever comes thus from the body. Only the body and its desires cause war, civil discord, and battles. For all wars are due to the desire to acquire wealth, and it is the body and the care of it to which we are enslaved, which compel us to acquire wealth, and all this makes us too busy to practice philosophy. So, I'm remembering that we went over this last time, so some obvious points to make. Wealth is given here as a worldly and therefore a bodily desire. Bodily desires cause war, civil discord, and battles. Body and soul is a feud, evil, desire for truth, body, need for nurture, busyness, inauthenticity, and we talked about things in themselves. Philosophy, love of wisdom, desire to observe things in themselves. So, part of what Socrates is saying here, and you can disagree with him, I guess, but his major point is that the body causes confusions by creating desires, needs to fulfill those, the need for nurture, and therefore all sorts of wants, desires, fears, all sorts of illusions, much nonsense gets between us and our ability to acquire knowledge. And Socrates is basically thrown on the table how much he values the acquisition of knowledge. Therefore, having a body is seen as sort of an impediment for Socrates. So, worst of all, if we do get some respite from it and turn to some investigations, everywhere in our investigations the body is present and makes for confusion and fear, so it prevents us from seeing the truth. So again, sort of the acknowledgement, everywhere in our investigations the body is present. So it really has been shown to us that if we are ever to have pure knowledge, we must escape from the body and observe things in themselves with the soul by itself. It seems likely that we shall, only then, when we are dead, attain that which we desire and of which we claim to be lovers, namely wisdom. And as our argument shows, not while we live, for it is impossible to attain any pure knowledge with the body, then one of two things is true. Either we can never attain knowledge, or we can do so after death. Then, and not before, the soul is by itself, apart from the body. While we live, we shall be closest to the knowledge if we refrain as much as possible from association with the body, and do not join with it more than we must, if we are infected with its nature, but purify ourselves from it till the God himself frees us. In this way we shall escape the contamination of the body's folly, shall be likely to be in the company of people of the same kind. Our own efforts we shall know all that is pure, which is presumably the truth, for it is not permitted to the impure to attain pure. So I have something that says Apollo for some reason as a note, but some important things to re-emphasize from that paragraph. Again, just the concept of if we are ever to have pure knowledge, we must escape from the body and observe things in themselves with the soul by itself. That's a really important concept, because whether you're Plato here or somebody later, like in Immanuel Kant, talking about the possibility or impossibility of pure knowledge, obviously it all refers back to these sort of Platonic dialogues. So, such are the things, Simmias, that all those who love learning in the proper manner must say to one another and believe. Or do you not think so? Certainly do, Socrates. And if this is true, my friend, said Socrates, there is good hope that on arriving where I'm going, if anywhere, I shall acquire what has been our chief preoccupation in our past life, so that the journey that is now ordered for me is full of good hope, and it also is from any other man who believes that his mind has been prepared and as it were purified. So, what's interesting here is we've kind of come back full circle for what Socrates was trying to get at the beginning, which is him explaining to his fellows why he's not losing it on account of the fact that he's going to be put to death, while they're obviously in varying amounts of distress. And what he's trying to point out to them, he says, if we cared about wisdom in the pursuit of it in the first place, then I'm going to be going to a place, as long as I'm adequately prepared, purified, etc., I'll be going to that place with no fear in my heart, and all I'll be able to do there is examine things without, like everybody has already agreed, death is the separation of the soul from the body. Now, maybe that was a bad thing to admit, because then maybe you nitpick and you say, oh, well, no, death is actually when the body ceases to have soul, but soul is a concept within the concept of body, referring again from a etymological perspective to the movement of it, the suke. So if that is the theory, you could say, once the body expires, then the soul, it's not that they're separated, it's that the soul ceases, and then the body, especially now that it's not moving in place, will deteriorate, etc. But what's interesting is, for such an ancient work of philosophy, Plato will come up with some examples later that really will get you to start questioning your understanding of death and the sequencing of whether it is or is not the case that the soul leaves the body, separates, etc. And you frankly might think, as I am somewhat inclined to think, that nobody can know about these things, kind of hide behind a bit of a Kantian epistemology where you push away certain questions of the pureness of the soul in itself, and you basically say, well, it's not possible to have that sort of knowledge. But I think the rationalists like Plato and later Kant, they're not going to be able to resist sort of the mathematical certainty that comes with certain forms of knowledge, and therefore they will be very reticent to surrender certainty and knowledge for the sake of what would, I think, ultimately result in pragmatism or something like it. But anyway, so to continue with, so again, though, all Socrates is trying to do here with this hoo-ha, therefore, he's just trying to convince his friends that they don't need to be so distressed about him being put to death. And he's pointing out, like, I'm gonna be, at worst, nothing will happen to me, I'm gone, which then he could acknowledge more so that will have, like, an effect on his friends, kind of reckon with, I guess, what responsibility you have to the people around you, and how much any one person can therefore have any blame or anything of the sort be assigned to them for the fact that they, didn't stay alive long enough, or whatever. You could think of a lot of different situations where you can go down that line of thinking. It's not necessarily a positive line of thinking, but to apply it directly to Socrates, in particular, what you would say to him is what Phaedo, and maybe somebody else has said this already, but it's definitely Phaedo who said it, like, what about your children, man? Like, this isn't a simple matter of being put to death. You and Xanthippe have a baby, whether or not it's, 2 or 3 year old at this point, whatever, but, like, they've got a very young child. You would think that Socrates would have reason to look after that child. You know what I'm saying? So, like, and Socrates has two other children, and one of them's an adult and the other one's a kid. So it's like Socrates has responsibilities that in a certain, not to put it in like an 80s, 90s sitcom way, but it's like, oh, he's running out on, the family situation, deadbeat dad gonna come back, whatever. You could make your arguments about that, and then that's where, I guess from Socrates' perspective, listening to Crito in his dialogue, you're just being like, hey, Crito, like, I've thought about a lot of these things already, and you're not really gonna convince me saying what you're saying. But then I guess the point that Crito makes but doesn't press in the right way is just like, tell me, Socrates, though, like, what is the responsibility of a father towards their children? And then who knows, Socrates could be a complete savage and be like, I don't have any responsibility. Or more likely, it's like, oh, it's whatever the laws dictating marriage and the family within my city dictate to me, that I follow those, and as long as those laws are good and I don't feel a need to persuade my society to change those rules, then I have an obligation to follow them. So some sort of minimum standard of conduct towards your children, I'm assuming. But again, I think you could really push Socrates a little more and be like, hey, like, whoa. Let's not be so flip here. Let's really consider, like, your children as a much more pragmatic concern, and maybe let's pierce the veil of ignorance a little bit here and try to get a little more serious and a little more real, a little bit less out of this sort of idealistic framework. But on the other hand, we have all these things that Socrates is saying, which are really profound points and interesting, whether you think they're similar to certain points in sort of Buddhist, or is it also Hindu ideology that basically the body is ultimately wrapped up in a material world that's illusory in some way. You're going through cycles, and the way that you want to essentially evolve is just to recognize the cycle, become enlightened, and escape to samsara. Or I have no freaking clue, and I'm kind of talking out of my ass, but like, that's just to say that there's this sort of common idea, though, that it's like whenever you've got a body, just the mere fact of you needing to respond to all sorts of physical stimuli, and you can extend it as far as you want and get into, your involuntarily bodily systems, where it's like, you don't even, really speaking, you don't even have a choice as to whether you're going to breathe. Like, human beings don't really have the ability to be like, well, I'm going to hold my breath until I am gone. It's like, well, you're not going to be able to do that voluntarily just because your body is going to take that over. There's certain processes, like your heartbeat, you can influence them by your activities in a positive or in a negative way to have more or less control, etc. But at the end of the day, all the responses to the stimuli, essentially, it's just like a limiting principle that as long as you're within this bodily sphere, you're always going to be facing limitations. And then the counter argument would be, is that really a bad thing? Or do certain limitations, such as remaining within a phenomenological realm, is that ultimately better for the process of trying to examine things? But again, to circle back to it, all Socrates is really trying to convince his fellows here is that when he's put to death, he feels like he's going to be just fine. And the interesting thing is just the intellectual gymnastics that this man goes through seemingly successfully in order to convince his friends that that he's either rightly oriented, or I'm sure he'd be open to have them sort of refute what he's saying, but I think he'd sort of challenge them to make sure that they actually do so. But, so to continue with Socrates talking about purification, says, does purification not turn out to be what we mentioned in our argument some time ago, namely to separate the soul as far as possible from the body and to accustom it to gather itself and collect itself out of every part of the body and to dwell by itself as far as it can, both now and in the future, freed as it were from the bonds of the body. So, again, the terminology here is somewhat interesting. I'm sure I'd have to go through the Greek to really fully understand it, but what we have here in terms of a dichotomy is a dichotomy between soul and body. Now, why I think that's interesting is just that it seems like he's talking more about a concept of mind, especially this idea, separate the soul as far as possible from the body to accustom it to gather itself, collect itself out of every part of the body, develop by itself as far as it can, both now and in the future. So I guess one interpretation of that, although I just thought about it in my mind, that's why it's hard to escape these ideas, but you could think about this and say like, oh well, if you could kind of withdraw the mind from the body as far as, just focus on sort of your brain, maybe your nervous system in itself, etc., trying to free from the bonds of the body. And the problem with that, again, is just that you're not collecting itself out of every part of the body. So it's important to understand, for the sake of the metaphor, that the soul is really considered to be a separate thing. And so when it seems like he's just talking about the mind and we associate that with the brain and etc., we don't want to take those sort of interpretations that wouldn't be the most useful to understanding it. But so talked about dwelling by itself as far as it can, both now and in the future, freed from the bonds of the body. And that freedom and separation of the soul from the body is called death. So one question would be, how do you practice for this freedom and separation of the soul? Do you learn to control your physical desires in as much as possible? Try to go the Epicurean route? What's the sort of approach to it, etc.? But after he says freedom and separation of the soul from the body is called death, it is only those who practice philosophy in the right way, we say, who always most want to free the soul, and this release and separation of the soul from the body is the preoccupation of the philosophers. So this is what they're preoccupied with. They say, so it appears. Therefore, as I said at the beginning, it would be ridiculous for a man to train himself in life to live in a state as close to death as possible, and then to resent it when it comes. So, sort of a training unto death. And then one question you would again say is, please explain what that means, how you practice philosophy in the right way. So next paragraph is, in fact, Simius, he said, those who practice philosophy in the right way are in training for dying, and they fear death least of all men. Consider it from this point of view, if they were altogether estranged from the body and desire to have their soul by itself, would it not be quite absurd for them to be afraid and resentful when this happens? If they did not gladly set out for a place where on arrival they may hope to attain that for which they had yearned during their lifetimes, that is wisdom, and where they would be rid of the presence of that from which they are estranged. Many men, at the death of their lovers, wives, or sons, were willing to go to the underworld, driven by the hope of seeing those for whose company they longed and being with them. Will then a true lover of wisdom, who has a similar hope and knows that he will never find it to any extent except in Hades, be resentful of dying and not gladly undertake the journey thither? One must surely think so, my friend, if he is a true philosopher, for he is firmly convinced he will not find pure knowledge anywhere except there, and if this is so, then, as I said just now, would it not be highly unreasonable for such a man to fear death? It certainly would, by Zeus, he said. Then you have a sufficient indication that any man whom you see resenting death was not a lover of wisdom, but a lover of the body, and also a lover of wealth or honors, either or both. So, so they say it's certainly as you say, and Simmias, he said, does not what is called courage belong especially to men of this disposition. So Socrates is pointing out that basically brave people tend not to resent death. Therefore, the people who are lovers of wisdom are not lovers of the body, wealth, or honors, and he also says, in the quality of moderation, which even the majority call by that name, that is, not to get swept off one's feet by one's passions, but to treat them with disdain and orderliness, is this not suited only to those who most of all despise the body and live the life of philosophy? Necessarily so. If you are willing to reflect on courage and moderation of other people, you will find them strange. What's way, Socrates? You know that they all consider death a great evil. Definitely, he said. And the brave among them face death when they do for fear of greater evils. That is so. Therefore, it is fear and terror that make all men brave, except the philosophers. Yet it is illogical to be brave through fear and cowardice. It certainly is. What of the moderate among them? Is their experience not similar? Is it license of a certain kind that makes them moderate? Say this is impossible, yet their experience of this unsophisticated moderation turns out to be similar. They fear to be deprived of the other pleasures which they desire, so they keep away from some pleasures because they are overcome by others. Now to be mastered by pleasure is what they call license, but what happens to them is that they master certain pleasures because they are mastered by others. This is like what we mentioned just now, that in some way it is a kind of license that has made them moderate. So I should really be breaking this down. There's just so much momentum that should I just keep reading to the next? No, I need to stop and review. So we're gonna pick up again we'll read 60 AD through the beginning of 69, but we want to go over again. So Socrates brings up, so he talks about practice philosophy in training for dying, fear death least of all men, altogether estranged from the body, desire to have their soul by itself, should gladly set out for that place where they can attain wisdom, and rid of the presence of that from which they're estranged. And then he brings up this is the strength of Plato and Socrates, is to bring up these poignant examples again. Many men at the death of their lovers, wives, or sons were willing to go into the underworld, driven by the hope of seeing those for whose company they longed and being with them. So that's a really poignant example. I think anybody with any sort of family or friendship ties to people who are no longer on this earth for the reason that, as they're talking about, that their soul has separated from their body, if their soul existed at all, and that there's a certain despair that people feel. And, it's interesting of Socrates pointing this out. This is slightly on the irony side, but I would say my interpretation of this irony, to give that sort of way of thinking about it, is that the irony in this case is something Socrates is really not realizing, is really lying very deep under the surface, where he's saying, like, that there's a lot of people who would really, appreciate to see those people, and who knows essentially if, Xanthippe or his children would be somebody like this who would, give anything to be able to be reunited with those for whose company they long being with them. So, such a poignant metaphor. And then he points out, he's like, if you're a true lover of wisdom, and you're never going to find it to any extent except in Hades, so then again, you just have to be aware this is the Platonic framework. If you don't agree with that, you're on a different path. Maybe you're on sort of the British empiricist path, where they say, all knowledge really does come from the body, and we can really trace it, and this, that way, and the other. The challenge is just the being able to explain necessary knowledge, things that are true of necessity, not because of the discovery of them as principles. In other words, we didn't discover the Pythagorean theorem in the sense that it started to exist. We expressed a relation that exists in nature. You can look at all sorts of examples if those of you are not familiar with this very basic thought experiment that you can test out literally anywhere in reality to confirm that you're not insane. You still exist in 3 dimensions of space, time, reality, etc. All you have to do is look at a point, space, time, and ask yourself the question of how many straight lines can go through that point, and you'll basically come up with a vertical line and a horizontal line and a diagonal line, and those are the only sort of, those are the lines that can be created from that point in space, and therefore you can know that space is 3-dimensional, because if you were to try and draw other lines, you would realize you're drawing lines of the kind that you already drew, and therefore, just look at any point and notice that you can only have 1, 2, 3 lines going through there, and that situates you in terms of 3-dimensional space. I honestly think if you would run that thought experiment through to Socrates, the man may have shit himself. But again, sort of the point of following Socrates along these lines, if you disagree with them, is to pick up the pearls of wisdom that are littered kind of throughout this process, so one of the things he points out is he says that the people who are truly brave, you don't want them to be brave just because they're ignorant. You want them to be brave because they have knowledge, and therefore that sort of bravery is virtuous and is sort of a solid foundation, not building on sand sort of thing. So when he points out, he says, any man who you see resenting death was not a lover of wisdom, a lover of the body, and courage belongs especially to men of this disposition who are, and he says, the quality of moderation, which even the majority call by that name, that is not to get swept off one's feet by one's passions. So again, you can run through the various sorts of passions, whether it's more of the purely physical passions or the more, again, you could look at somebody like a Euthyphro and say, well, why is he prosecuting his father? Ultimately, it's a result of passionate decision-making, not truly of logical decision-making. And so Socrates is pointing out that if you're moderate, you avoid being swept off your feet by one's passions, treat them with disdain and orderliness, and says this is suited to those who most of all despise the body and live the life of philosophy. So then Socrates continues, if you are willing to reflect on the courage and moderation of other people, and he says you'll find them strange. They all consider death a great evil, so they agree with this, and the brave among them face death when they do for fear of greater evils. So kind of Socrates' point that he made when he was on his trial, where it's like, I fear death, I guess, to some extent, but the thing I really fear is doing the wrong thing, and therefore I can't just do the wrong thing just because it's going to help me avoid my death, because then I'm going to be living in a bad world, a worse world, whatever. So that's kind of a framework that you can think of that through. And then one of the great quotes I think in all of Plato, and I have a photo of this somewhere, is just a screenshot of this sort of page, but this quote where he says, therefore it is fear and terror that make all men brave except the philosophers, yet it is illogical to be brave through fear and cowardice. So again, he is pointing out that this is maybe a more common way of experiencing what braveness, but braveness would I guess be practiced in a more pure manner by the philosopher, etc. And then, what are the moderates? Is their experience not similar? License of a certain kind that makes them moderate. Yet their experience of this unsophisticated moderation turns out to be similar. They fear to be deprived of other pleasures which they desire, so they keep away from some pleasures because they're overcome by others. Now, to be mastered by pleasure is what they call license, but what happens to them is that they master certain pleasures because they're mastered by others. This is like what we mentioned just now, that in some way it is a kind of license that has made them moderate. So, I honestly don't even have more of a breakdown of this. I really should focus more on this. Maybe I'll do like a subsequent episode where I just come back to this section and really break it down word for word, because I don't know, the sort of point that Socrates is making here is starting to break down, in my opinion, of is it license of a kind that made them moderate? We say this is impossible, yet their experiences of this unsophisticated moderation turns out to be similar. So, unsophisticated moderation versus a more sophisticated moderation. But anyway, Simmias says it seems likely, so he's just going along with this. And then so Socrates then says, my good Simmias, I fear this is not the right exchange to attain virtue, to exchange pleasures for pleasures, pains for pains, and fears for fears, the greater for the less, like coins, that the only valid currency for which all these things should be exchanged is wisdom. With this we have real courage and moderation and justice, and in a word, true virtue. With wisdom, whether pleasures and fears and all such things be present or absent, when these things are exchanged for one another in separation from wisdom, such virtue is only an illusory appearance of virtue. It is in fact fit for slaves without soundness of truth, whereas in truth moderation and courage and justice are a purging away of all such things, and wisdom itself is a kind of cleansing or purification. It is likely that those who established the mystic rites for us were not inferior persons, or were speaking riddles long ago when they said, that whoever arrives in the underworld uninitiated and unsanctified will wallow in the mire, whereas he who arrives there purified and initiated will dwell with the gods. There are indeed, as those concerned with the mysteries say, many who carry the thyrsus, I'm going to spell that, Thyrsus, but the Bacchants are few. So, let me say that again. Thyrsus. There are indeed, as those concerned with the mysteries say, many who carry the thyrsus, but the Bacchants are few. So, that is true worshippers of Dionysus, as opposed to those who only carry the external symbols of his worship. So the interesting thing here, to put it almost in the way that Nietzsche frames the Platonic dialogues in terms of the Apollonian struggle against Dionysian sort of framework, but I think throughout these dialogues, Socrates kind of makes use of the both, and so here again too, another mention of mystic rites, and that the people who established these were not inferior. Cleansing and purification therefore has some sort of purpose to it, but then he says, well, we could view in sort of a modern sense, and if all my allusions to this end up being about Catholic things as opposed to any other particular branch of any religion, that's just my own personal bias, but it's like there's a lot of people who go to church and frankly not very many Christians, and the difference is that essentially is kind of what Jesus will get to when he's preaching his stuff, which is essentially that these paths to walk, especially in these mystic traditions, they're very difficult, and they're meant to sort people out, and you essentially can't do it half-assed. And what Socrates is hinting at here is that in his framework, he thinks he's going to his death purified because he's been practicing philosophy and trying to prepare himself for death. What he's essentially, I think, saying, though, I've had this idea in the past, is that Socrates essentially has a sort of almost, not psychopathic, but excessively rational view of the value of his life, that he certainly valued his life to some extent, but not enough to disgrace himself in any situation. So by following his sort of the mantic path of his daimonic sign and all these things, he's been able to avoid a lot of these impurities, and he's kind of pointing out, again, to make the comparison between him and Jesus, but to say, I fear it is not the right exchange to attain virtue, to exchange pleasures for pleasures, pain for pains, fears for fears, greater or less, like coins, that the only currency for which all these things should be exchanged is wisdom. So, slightly different path than, exactly what Jesus was preaching, but it's another person saying that these sort of typical thoughts of, matching pleasure for pleasure, tit for tat, especially responding with retributive justice in kind for injustices done to oneself. We've already seen that it's a Socratic framework that he rejects these sorts of things. And again, it's probably because Socrates is sort of a participant in these sort of mysteries to whatever extent that he does, where he thinks that he's been purified. And so again, to restate that awesome sentence, there are indeed, as concerned those with the mysteries, many who carry the thyrsus, but the Bacchants are few. These latter are, in my opinion, no other than those who have practiced philosophy in the right way. I have in my life left nothing undone in order to be counted among these as far as possible, as I have been eager to be in every way. Whether my eagerness was right and we accomplished anything, we shall, I think, know for certain in a short time, God willing, on arriving yonder. So, okay, we've got here Socrates sort of stating the sort of no regrets sort of philosophy of things, not to be too flip about it, but he said, I have nothing in my life left undone in order to be counted among these as far as possible. I've been eager in every way to purify myself, and therefore and then he points out, he says, whether my eagerness was right, whether we accomplished anything, but he does say we shall know in a short time, God willing, on arriving yonder, which again, it's like, well, if you're wrong, you don't arrive anywhere. But I'm nitpicking a little, and we should continue to roll on. So he says, this is my defense, Simmias and Cebes, that I am likely to be right to leave you and my masters here, without resentment or complaint, leaving that, as here, I shall find good masters and good friends, if my defense is more convincing to you than to the Athenian jury, it will be well. So, this is this right here. We're at 70 right now, and we're probably gonna stop relatively soon. But this is where this dialogue turns up a level from already. It's one of the great dialogues, but this actually reminds me a lot of the beginning of the Republic, and this goes in my book from page 267 to 278 is where I'm reading from right now. So this is only like 11 pages in the Republic. I think you've got something similar, you can argue, where some people have argued that Republic Book 1 is an earlier dialogue that's been patched together with essentially, not to be rude, but a bunch of other bullshit that's been tacked onto the back of it because it made sense, essentially, but that the first book of Republic is essentially a self-contained dialogue that expresses everything it needed to express within that itself, and therefore everything else is somewhat superfluous. And you can kind of look at this dialogue as having a similar structure where there's sort of more of an introduction sort of style section. It's more of a stylized story, and then the other thing is just it's longer. And this is what you will realize as you start to read the Platonic dialogues. One of the, I guess, the drawbacks is the deeper you get into the literature, the longer the dialogues tend to get. They tend to get more complicated, but what I think is good, and you'll see it here in 70, is we've got Socrates making these arguments where it's like, I think this, and this, and that, and that. And then after he makes these arguments and he thinks that he has resolved the issue, Plato's going to take things to another level, where he's going to say, no, you thought we were done, but actually, pump fake, I'm back, and I'm back with even more sophisticated shit than what we were just talking about. We're going to reveal that what we just went over is only the basics, almost like in the mystic tradition, sort of the orientation events that happen just to prepare you for what's going to happen afterwards. So remember when I've said we've gone through Euthyphro, we've gone through Apology, we've gone through Crito. In the Euthyphro appears to be wise for all of about half a page before he starts looking like a dimwit. None of Socrates' prosecutors that interact with him in the Apology appear to have the slightest shred of intelligence, which again is that Plato sort of stacking the deck in his mentor's favor and not presenting things properly. Make your argument, but based on the way they are presented, those people were dunces. But anyway, and then you get the Crito, and Crito is somebody that you would expect to be on a different level of sophistication, and clearly he is from some of the some of the answers that he gives, and he drives the discussion forward to some interesting areas. But I think you'd still put him on a similar level with Crito, where you'd say he's a good interlocutor, but he's really not a great interlocutor. He's kind of getting run over by Socrates a lot, and so on. But I think this is when Plato's Phaedo begins to separate itself as a dialogue, and this is why I wanted to read it before reading Protagoras or Gorgias or one of these other dialogues. I think when you read this one, you will have an understanding of essentially how sophisticated things can really get, and then you'll have a good preparation for all the other dialogues, in particular Republic, because I remember just the first few episodes I did of Phaedo reading through and being like, well, geez, it is significantly useful to understand Republic, to already be familiar with the allegory of the cave and all these sorts of ideas. And so, but anyways, I'm going to stop talking about it and be about it. So we're talking about 70 in the Greek pagination. So again, this is my defense, Simmias and Cebes, that I'm likely to be right to leave you, my masters, here without resentment or complaint, believing that here is there, or there is here, I shall find good masters and good friends. If my defense is more convincing to you than the Athenian jury, it will be well. When Socrates finished, Cebes intervened. Socrates, he said, everything else you said is excellent, I think. But men find it very hard to believe what you said about the soul. They think that after it has left the body, it no longer exists anywhere, but that it is destroyed and dissolved on the day the man dies, as soon as it leaves the body, and that, on leaving it, it is dispersed like breath or smoke, has flown away and gone, and is no longer anything anywhere. If indeed it had gathered itself together and existed by itself and escaped those evils you were recently enumerating, there would then be much good hope, Socrates, that what you say is true. But to believe this requires a good deal of faith and persuasive argument, to believe that the soul still exists after a man has died, and that it still possesses some capability and intelligence. So Socrates' response to this, just to give that really quickly, but it's funny. He says, what you say is true, Cebes. Socrates said, well, what shall we do? You want to discuss whether this is likely to be true or not? And then Cebes says, personally, I should like to hear your opinion on this subject. Okay. Yeah, we're definitely going to pause here at 70C and not continue with this, because actually, you know what? I'm going to read the rest of that paragraph after I get through here, and then we're just going to stop at 71, because then it starts getting a little more silly, but there's something important here that I should read. So, but again, to go over it again, what he said, that's so excellent of what Cebes says in his intervention. So he says first, Socrates, what you've said is excellent. So this is a good thing to do, where you've got to acknowledge when somebody like Socrates, whether he's a sophist or not, you have to acknowledge the sophistication, because if you don't, you're not really participating honestly sort of in the process of how these things work, etc. So it's good that he says everything you said was excellent, but men find it very hard to believe what you said about the soul. So again, we've got another allusion to sort of what the majority thinks. I don't think that Socrates necessarily appreciates that, but the idea that's going to be expressed here is very interesting, where he says they think after it has left the body, it no longer exists anywhere, but that it is destroyed and dissolved on the day the man dies, as soon as it leaves the body, and that on leaving it, it is dispersed like breath or smoke, has flown away and gone, and is no longer anything anywhere. So this is, I think, basically my theory, which, you can essentially, you can rejoinder this with, it's hard to make a truly logical argument against this, although Socrates will make good arguments against it. I just don't know how logical they are, but I think that there's something that has to be said for the strength of this idea that essentially, no matter whether people in the world, no matter whether they have their particular beliefs about what happens after death, etc., I think that everybody has this in common, if not as a belief, as a fearful possibility. Because again, this is why people are afraid of death, is that upon their death, what will occur is that the soul leaving the body means that it no longer exists anywhere, because it doesn't exist without its host. Therefore, the soul is destroyed on the day that the man dies, and therefore there's no, he says, if indeed it gathered itself together and existed by itself and escaped these evils that you were recently enumerating, there would then be much good hope, Socrates, for what you say is true. But to believe this requires a good deal of faith and persuasive argument. To believe that the soul exists after a man has died and that it still possesses some capability and intelligence. So, another point to make is that CB's is saying here, it's not good enough even just that the soul existed in some sense where it's like, oh, well, your soul's not attached to your body, and it's also not really gone anywhere where it's attached to any other body, but in a very sort of almost purely physical sense, energy is conserved, not created or destroyed. Therefore, if your soul was ever anything in itself, then, it still exists in, some metaphorical sense, but CB's is saying, like, if it doesn't possess capability, intelligence, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the soul seriously continuing to exist. And he says that believing this requires a good deal of faith and persuasive argument. So in other words, faith is not good enough. You need persuasive arguments in order to, make somebody convinced of this. So then CB says, I'd like to hear Socrates' opinion on the subject. I do not think, said Socrates, that anyone who heard me now, not even a comic poet, could say that I am babbling and discussing things that do not concern me. So we must examine the question thoroughly. If you think we should do so, let us examine it in some such manner as this, whether the souls of men who have died exist in the underworld or not. We recall an ancient theory that souls arriving there come from here, and then again that they arrive here and are born here from the dead. If that is true, then the living come back from the dead, then surely our souls must exist there, for they could not come back if they did not exist. And this is sufficient proof that these things are so, that it truly appears that the living never come from any other source than from the dead. If this is not the case, we should need another argument. So, this is sort of and he calls it an ancient theory. It's a theory of reincarnation of some sort, and when Socrates says even a comic poet, he's probably referring directly to Aristophanes and saying, I'm not just babbling or discussing things that don't concern me. Again, I think that has to be an allusion to the clouds, so maybe Socrates is a little traumatized by what his friend did to him, honestly, but he wants to examine the question thoroughly, And he is examining in such manners as whether souls of men who have died exist in the underworld or not. And in ancient theory, the souls arrive there, come from here, then again they arrive here and are born from the dead. And if that's true, the living come back from the dead, then our souls surely exist there. So this hints at sort of the Greek idea that a lot of them believed in some sort of an infinite return theory as regards the universe, in the sense that there's no beginning to the universe. The universe simply exists, and so essentially how could you get being out of non-being? And that's a big shift from sort of the Greco way of looking at things to the way that things are presented in Genesis, etc. And so, let's see. So, what's interesting in this paragraph also is, so Socrates is examining a question. So he's not even necessarily saying that he believes in this theory of reincarnation, although it's pretty obvious that he does. And again, this will feed into Plato's theory of transmigration of the souls as an explanation for the existence of knowledge, essentially. And yeah, I'm not even gonna read into the next paragraph, because the next paragraph, it really starts to get a bit more metaphorical, and then this is where, to be honest, despite the strength of this dialogue, this is likely the weak point, so we'll want to go over this in more detail next time. But again, one of the strong points of Plato, but also one of the problems, is if you essentially don't believe in, justice in itself, or this, that in itself, and you think that sort of analysis is ultimately misguided in the sense that it can't really get you anywhere, and that we need to satisfy ourselves with sort of familial resemblance sort of theory or whatever else it happens to be. But what's interesting, though, before we get into that sort of sillier argument, I guess is you could look at it from the Socratic irony perspective and say, this is Socrates pointing out to people, it's like, hey, I'm not necessarily right here, and it's not certain that that the souls of men who have died exist in the underworld or not, and that it's based on ancient theories. And so he's saying, well, if that theory is true, then our souls have to exist there. So that's almost a conditional proof, where you say, if P then Q, and theoretically, if you had P, therefore you would have Q, and then sometimes having or going through the exercise of understanding what P would lead to in terms of Q can be useful in sort of logical proofs in things like sentential, propositional logic, etc. But what Socrates is kind of pointing out is they might need an additional argument in order to demonstrate that the living have to come from a source that is basically the opposite of life. And basically, if it's not the case that souls arrive here from the underworld, and that therefore souls also arrive in the underworld from here, then Socrates is going to need a different argument. So I think next time for pod 38, I'm going to just return back and continue through. I guess we're going to read 70E through, trying to figure out a stopping point so that I can, because for the next page, what he starts to do is he starts to make this argument that all things come from their opposites. And what you could essentially say is, hey bud, too metaphorical, can't apply the metaphor that far. But he literally thinks that, tallness comes from shortness, and all these opposites really come from each other. And so, there's all sorts of points. I have sort of arguments against these things in the margins, etc. But I think we're going to want to and we're probably going to stop next time before we even get to 73, because honestly, by the time we get to 73, I just seeing mention of you are accustomed to mention frequently, learning is nothing other than recollection. So, I don't want to do that for this time. I want to pause before that. So, we're going to pause here and come back on this next time. But, just going over some things that we went through in this episode. Again, didn't go through a ton of the content, although we went from 66, so we did pretty well. But Socrates kind of solidified his point, saying, if we believe that the body is essentially an impediment towards the acquisition of knowledge, then me being separated from my body is likely a benefit to me, all things considered. So I'm trying to practice philosophy the right way. I've tried to follow all the mysteries, etc. Like, I feel confident in this thing. And then also an important point here, mentioning the fact that essentially true courage, moderation, etc. don't come from fear. They come from knowledge. So most people, if they are moderate or courageous, usually are courageous through fear of some greater thing that they fear, and they weigh things. But Socrates is trying to point to sort of a different path and talking about the way to attain virtue, wanting to avoid exchanging pleasures for pleasures, pain for pains, trying to get out of the illusory appearance of virtue. And when these things are exchanged for each other in separation from wisdom, such virtue is only an illusory appearance of virtue, and problematic. It is fit for slaves. But again, you've got to sort of take Socrates' perspective. He's got certain problematic things to say, and he says them. But again, he gets to this point where essentially Cebes makes this really important point about what if the soul is destroyed upon death, and then Socrates is going to have to resort to certain arguments in order to convince him, and it'll be up to you as to whether you're convinced by those arguments. But just wanted to get that episode recorded really quickly. So, and I guess right here at the end, I doubt, frankly, anybody's going to listen this deep into the episode other than me, but I just wanted to mention really quickly that my YouTube channel has kind of flatlined in terms of viewership over the last few days, which I'm honestly not sure what the deal is. I think I scheduled some videos ahead for a few days ahead of time. Maybe that gummed up the process or whatever, but it's a little bit of a worrisome thing that the page is seemingly not generating any traffic right now, and that's less than ideal. So I'm hoping I can resolve that sometime soon. But I guess at the end here I'd say, please like and subscribe, whatever. But any engagement you happen to give through this channel is well and good appreciated, and any feedback you've got over things that I could do better, etc. I'd certainly appreciate any of that. And I'm going to continue to put out content, at least for a while, even if it doesn't get any viewership. But ultimately, I was trying to see if it could be more commercially viable. So if there's no viewership, that'll have to be taken into serious consideration. But for now, I'm going to try to just plow forward. And as Socrates might tell me, I'm certainly not proceeding with wisdom because I don't exactly know what I'm doing, but we're trying to figure it out. So that's it for this time. Thanks.